pressed the wrong button and ended the whole stream. So let's not do that. All right, we are live. Joining me today is an extra special guest, Luke Roelofs. Luke, thanks for joining me today. And I wonder if you would just say a little bit about who you are and what you do for those who might not know you.
Thanks. Yeah, hi Richard. Thanks for having me on. I'm a postdoc at the Center for Mind, Brain, and Consciousness at New York University. And I work on, I always have trouble summarizing the somewhat disparate things I work on, but I'd broadly say the metaphysics and to some extent ethics of consciousness.
Very good. Okay, short and pithy. I like that. Yeah, and you have a book which just recently came out called Combining Minds, which I guess is mostly on the metaphysics of consciousness. But you're also, I guess, working on a second book already, which is on empathy, and that maybe is where the ethics comes in.
Yeah, that's right. So that's trying to kind of draw out the implications of us being the sort of creature that you can only fully understand from the inside, that is, conscious creatures. And I think that is important for how we think and feel about each other, that we, that there's something missing unless I can put myself in your perspective. But most of my published work to date, as you say, is on the metaphysics side very much.
Very cool. Okay, well, I want to get to ask you about some of the empathy stuff maybe a little bit later on, but I guess I wanted to start by asking you about your views about the metaphysics of consciousness. And I'm a big fan of this book, by the way. I hope more people read it. It's some of the best of philosophy it represents, in my opinion. It's careful, it's clear, it's well thought out, and it argues for a thesis which is just dismissed out of hand. And by the end of the book, you find yourself thinking, wait, maybe it shouldn't be dismissed out of hand. So I think, to me, that's the beauty of philosophy, is when you can take an idea like that and carefully argue for it. So
that's the goal, yeah.
Yeah, and it's not done. Big ideas like that aren't done enough. So I think that's very cool. And you consider yourself a defender of panpsychism, although that's not the main focus of the book, because you do have the last 2/3 of it where you focus on other things, but a large part of it is aimed at defending a thesis of panpsychism. Is that right?
That's right, yeah. So I kind of think of it as one step downstream from panpsychism, in that it's addressing what I think is the biggest challenge for panpsychism, the combination problem. Yeah. But it's addressing it in part by trying to show that it's actually a much wider problem. It's something that matters for physicalists, really for, I think, almost any view except the kind of Cartesian dualism that makes the mind an absolutely simple thing.
Right, simple without parts. So if anything with parts, basically, you're going to end up focusing some version of the combination problem.
That's the idea, yeah.
Yeah. And so at the beginning of the book, you kind of try to motivate panpsychism, even though that's not the main focus. You do sort of defend it. And so I wondered if we could just start maybe with the 4 kinds of arguments that you give at the beginning of the book about why one should take panpsychism seriously.
Yeah. So I mean, I kind of came to panpsychism because I felt torn. On the one hand, I was very attracted to the sort of naturalistic worldview that is usually associated with physicalism. The idea that, for understanding the structure of the world, science should be our authority. And what it seems to tell us is that there's basically just one type of stuff, and we're all made of it. And there's nothing special or magical about human brains. We're just a very complicated arrangement of the same things that are in everything else. But at the same time, I also felt the pull of these, the standard anti-physicalist arguments that are discussed a lot in the literature, the knowledge argument, the conceivability argument, all of which seem to show that a purely physical account of the brain just leaves something out. It doesn't quite explain or capture why there's anything it's like for us from the inside. And so that's kind of the basic driving thought, is this explanatory problem for a purely physical ontology that seems to motivate accepting consciousness as some kind of irreducible ingredient. So then if you make that step, though, if you think consciousness is going to be part of our fundamental ontology, and you ask, well, where is it going to go? How did it fit into the world?
Right.
I think the other three arguments that I give there are sort of trying to motivate it as against more dualistic sorts of views. So one of those is the causal argument. People have talked a lot about mental causation. It looks like we can give a fully physical explanation of every event, including every motion of my body. So if there was consciousness that was something apart from the physical, it's not clear how it would do anything. It's not clear how it would kind of find work to do in this causal story. Another is the continuity argument, which says, between me and, I don't know, this pillow, there's a potentially, we could draw an arbitrarily fine-grained continuum of intermediate states, intermediate arrangements of matter that would differ just in very small degrees. And we kind of do see this, on the phylogenetic scale, from humans through simpler animals down to single-celled organisms. And it doesn't look like there's any magic point where you could kind of think, well, consciousness appears right here. Before this, no consciousness at all. After this, there's some consciousness. So both of those arguments push us towards wanting consciousness to be part of the physical world, not something kind of added at a certain point.
Right.
And so the fourth argument, I'm hoping I remember what the four are here.
Sorry.
The intrinsic natures argument,
right,
is trying to say, actually, if you really analyze what the physical sciences tell us, you realize that there is a way for consciousness to fit in, because what physics tells us is essentially a very rich story about how things interact, how things behave, how things are structured, but without ever directly addressing what these things are. You look at the physical characterization of an electron, and essentially you're told dispositional facts about how it is disposed to move under various circumstances. You're told, how does it relate to certain other properties or certain other particles? But it all kind of leaves this kind of unanswered question: what are these various things that interact in this way? And so contemporary panpsychists think, well, if the intrinsic nature of the physical world is actually not spoken to by the physical sciences, and if we do seem to have a kind of insight in the case of the matter of our own brains into what this is kind of from the inside, then maybe the simplest view is that it's all some version of that the intrinsic nature of matter in general is something like the consciousness that we experience, though presumably much simpler in ways that are kind of they really stretch our powers of imagination. Yeah, did I get all four of them there?
You did, yeah. A+ for remembering your own stuff. I mean, so one question that I have is why you find these arguments so motivating. I mean, I'm all for exploring cool ideas, and I think you do an excellent job of that. But with respect to the conceivability arguments, for example, there are well-known responses to that. For myself personally, I think that it's conceivably true that consciousness is a physical property, that there are duplicates of us that are conscious, things that Keith Frank has called anti-zombies, I've called zombies or whatever. And so I'm just curious generally why we should put so much credence in a priori reasoning in this area, especially emphasizing explanatory value, which was what you sort of emphasized in your version of it. Is that there's this, we can't understand how to explain consciousness in physical terms, so that suggests that it's not itself physical. And I know about the two-dimensional versions of conceivable blah blah, but I just wonder why we should. I shouldn't blah 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 all that important stuff. I can tell it's maybe what you're going to say, but I just wonder what motivates you to take that stuff as seriously as someone like you does.
Yeah, so it's a good question. I mean, it is kind of a tangle of competing methodologies. I mean, so I guess in part, It's that I, just at the object level, I find the responses to the responses more compelling than the responses. So like I don't think that anti-zombies I don't think that's something that you're conceiving of in the same way as zombies, because they have this built-in modal element. So you're actually conceiving of facts about other possible worlds when you conceive of that one. It's also, though, that like the formal arguments are kind of drawing out what I think is a very simple, like everyday intuition. I mean, most people don't think about zombies spontaneously, but most people do think about spectrum inversion.
Right.
At some point in their lives, they have this realization that, if someone else, was having different experiences when they looked at things than I was, but had always been that way and was seeing things in was learning to associate the same words. How would I ever find out? And the realization that no amount of information that you acquire from the third person, no amount of details about how their brain works would ever remove that doubt entirely. I don't think you have to be a philosopher to kind of to notice that and to think that that's telling us something fairly deep about the nature of the phenomena here. I mean, I guess I also, to some extent, want to maybe just turn things around on the opponents and say, if you don't want to do a priori reasoning, why do you believe in non-conscious matter? Because there's a way of framing panpsychism where you start with, okay, well, I know that there's a bit of conscious stuff here, and I'm surrounded by things that I see from the outside, so I don't know whether they're conscious. And to a certain extent, whether they're conscious is not going to be a directly empirically resolved matter. So, just as you can ask, well, why should we listen to arguments telling us that we should attribute consciousness to them? I can say, why should we listen to the arguments, if physicalists have them, for not doing so, for thinking that there's anything that is without consciousness?
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. I would just say on the first thing about, I don't want to spend too much time on this because there's too many other interesting, this is really just the opening salvo, and all the stuff that comes after it is really more interesting, I'd say, with respect to what you're doing. But about the anti-zombies or zombies or whatever, I guess I would say, I don't think you are conceiving anything modally there, anything more than you are. You're simply saying there's a world at which there's nothing but physical stuff, and there's also consciousness. So it's not like conceiving, necessarily if P then Q, so I don't really buy that sort of response. So I don't, but anyway, so that's just a side remark, I guess I'd say.
I mean, I think the thing is that there's a lot built into that nothing but.
Right.
So when you say I'm conceiving of nothing but the physical stuff, clearly you don't mean the nothing but to exclude. You then saying, I'm also conceiving of consciousness.
Right.
And I guess I assume that what's going on there is you're thinking, well, I'm conceiving of the consciousness as just coming from, or kind of nothing over and above the physical stuff.
Right.
Which means that you are trying to specifically conceive of it as necessitated by, or somehow kind of related to, the physical stuff.
I don't think it needs to be necessitated, just physical. And so then if you wanted to spell out what that meant, I mean, I think you have to do the same with the zombies, right? So if you want to say that it's just physical stuff, you have to have a that's all clause as well. And that may involve some modal stuff, as depending on how you flesh that out. But yeah, I mean, I think, the easiest thing to do is just say consciousness is physical. And then there's an open question about whether identities are modally necessary. I think that's something that, so all you really need is like an axiom of identity that says, if X equals Y, then if F of X, then G of, G of F of Y or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if that really addresses the seeming, the epistemic distinctiveness of this particular identity.
Mm-hmm.
Standard scientific identities like, lightning is atmospheric electrical discharge, they don't generate the same epistemic sense of a gap, because, given the full physical story, you can deduce that this identity holds. You can see that the thing we call lightning, the thing we encounter under these circumstances, will be this physically characterized phenomenon. But as you say, there's a lot of trench warfare over this topic. And to some extent, I have sort of tried to kind of step past it and think, well, suppose that the anti-physicalist arguments hold water. What would we do next? Where would we go from there?
Right. Yeah, exactly. So I think that's where all the action really is in the book, at least. But I was just curious because I am always sort of mystified that people take our own reasoning ability so seriously that they're willing to sort of go to take the anyway. So I don't. But that's neither here nor there. So let's go ahead and then I guess the other thing I was going to ask is, well, if you don't like physicalism and you don't like dualism either, but I guess the argument against dualism, the causal argument, I guess I'm a little bit suspicious of, because once you read Hume, you're like, who the hell knows? Anything can cause anything, really. So I'm not really sure that really gets at it. But also, I think really this is where the continuity thesis really comes in, right? So this is what's really doing the work. So let me ask you, how do you feel about like post-Humean views of causation? Do you think that has any effect on the argument?
So that definitely, undermines a certain way of framing the causal issue. It undermines Descartes' problem about, things being in contact with other things.
Right.
And there's no a priori difficulty with having kind of an extra causal factor. But I think there are a few reasons to be very skeptical that there actually is such a thing. I mean, one is you might just think, well, why haven't we found it yet? Why have we not observed anything happening in the brain that violates the known laws of physics? But you might also think, look, even if we did, if we're going to postulate a law, a causal law of nature that governs something that exists only in a very rare sort of physical structure, only in brains, then it's going to have to be a far more complex law than any of the standard physical ones. It's this kind of appeal that to how simple the physical laws are that you can supposedly write them all on a T-shirt. But if the law is somehow going to explain why only in brains do you get this extra thing appearing, then the statement of the law would have to include a physical specification of the structure of a minimally necessary brain, and that will be much more than a T-shirt. That might be more than all the T-shirts in the world.
At least a hoodie.
At least a hoodie. Yeah.
So do you think that same kind of argument is you can marshal it against emergentist versions of panpsychism?
I do, yeah. I think I've never been very attracted to the emergentist versions of panpsychism precisely for this reason. It seems like they're going to have all of the same sorts of problems. They might be able to mitigate some of the problems to some extent. I don't know if I'm the fairest kind of exponent of how they see the mitigation happening, right. But they will sometimes say things like it's less problematic for one sort of consciousness to emerge from another than for any sort of consciousness to emerge from something completely non-conscious. Maybe I can see the force of that intuition,
right?
But I guess I'm sort of more motivated by these like considerations of simplicity and continuity.
Yeah. Okay. So suppose that one is convinced by these anti-physicalist arguments and also suspicious of dualism as you are. So then we start looking at panpsychism. The biggest problem for panpsychism has always been the combination problem. I think that's since at least since James, I think, right, William James.
Arguably, yeah.
Person to point it out, maybe. So can you first tell us how you interpret the combination problem, and then we'll start talking about how the combining mind stuff experience inheritance and all that thing.
Yeah. So I have this slogan I like to say that the combination problem is a combination of problems.
Yeah.
You can read different people talking about it, and the actual argument that they give is completely different because it's kind of an umbrella term for a few different difficulties. But the basic difficulty is that if panpsychism is going to make any progress over physicalism in terms of rendering human consciousness explainable, it's going to have to do so in a way that relates complex composite consciousness in us to some sort of more basic consciousness. And the obvious way to do that is to think, well, look, the human brain is a complex physical structure that is nothing over and above a bunch of simpler physical structures standing in certain physical relations. So the natural thought is that the human mind will likewise be nothing over and above a bunch of simpler minds standing in certain mental relationships. But when you try to think through what that means, it rapidly becomes very difficult. And people have, for a long time, actually, in some ways before any discussion of panpsychism specifically, have argued that there's something specifically impossible about that. You can find these arguments going back to Descartes, Plotinus, people saying, look, minds are indivisible, minds are unified in this special way that differentiates them from any divisible composite system. And they've usually used this as an argument for dualism, often actually as an argument for immortality,
Right.
since they add the premise that the destruction can only mean like the separation of parts. But these intuitions, I think, run fairly deep. I call it the anti-combination intuition. And it comes out in a few particular ways that I can talk about, but that I think is the kind of the core idea.
Yeah, no, go ahead. And if you want to talk about those particular ways, that'd be great.
Yeah. Well, so one way that it comes out, I think, is when we think about mental relations. So, one of the things that immediately strikes me if I wake up in the morning and I decide to check on my consciousness is that I'm having a lot of experiences at once, tactile, visual, emotional, cognitive, and so on. But they're all unified.
Right.
And there's been a lot of work on what exactly does that mean when you say that they're unified. But there's some really interesting sort of phenomenal relation among my experiences. They're experienced together. And if they are, somehow coming to me from distinct parts of me, then it looks like we're going to want to think of these relations as relations that can obtain between different subjects.
Right.
And that's a very unfamiliar idea. We're used to kind of thinking, well, there's the external relations between my experiences and yours, and then there's the internal relations between my experiences and my other experiences. But if minds combine, then those two things have to somehow be like, maybe at opposite ends of a spectrum, but there has to be continuity between them. So a different angle is to focus on subjects, on the I, the self, whatever you call it. Because if I'm composed of these many simpler minds, then it looks like those minds, each of them individually isn't me. It is, in some sense, someone else. And yet I'm not someone else, I'm me. And so people have kind of been very puzzled by, and there's a certain kind of vertigo that you get when you really think about, okay, I am just a bunch of these, other people or other subjects. Yeah, so those are, I think, two of the kind of key aspects of it. There are others I catalog far too many, I think.
Yeah, you bring up, I was going to ask something else, but you brought up just now sort of, I guess it was a slip a little bit. You said people instead of subjects. But personhood, obviously, I guess why you did that was because personhood is a much more complicated issue, but you don't think of these micro subjects as persons, because that would require rationality and, possibly, or do you, I guess?
So yeah, standardly, I would say no. I'd say certainly at the fundamental level, the electron minds or whatever there is at the fundamental level, um, we our only guide to the structure of their consciousness is the structure of their behavior, and that's so simple that it seems completely unwarranted to attribute a capacity for reflection, decision making, memory, planning, any of that stuff that we associate with personhood. It may be that there are intermediate scales on which you do have multiple persons in the brain. So I talk a bit about the split brain phenomenon and the slightly troubling observation that I can continue to be somewhat recognizable as the self-conscious person I am, with one or the other of my cerebral hemispheres missing.
Right.
I'm paralyzed at first on part of my body. I have various difficulties, but it looks like my core kind of conscious capacities are somewhat redundantly instantiated in the brain. And so it may well be that there are, in somewhere on the scale between electrons and me, there may be parts of me that exhibit, these capacities to some extent.
Yeah, that's interesting. I want to get to the split brain stuff a little bit later.
Mm-hmm.
So let's talk about the electron. I mean, so one thing you say in the beginning of the book is that you're sort of agnostic about whether particles are the ultimate stopping point for physics, and that if it turned out that there weren't, it would be okay with you, that what you're talking about is properties of whatever the fundamental level of physical reality is. And so I guess I was a little bit puzzled by what I thought was maybe a kind of a quick move on your part there, because certainly if you take like a field ontology, which like quantum field theory or something like that, then it doesn't seem like you're going to get, it doesn't seem like you're going to be able to attribute minds to little bits, or to that there's intrinsic natures or something. And this, a large part is part of an argument, I guess, for like ontic structural realism, which, maybe I think that you don't accept. But so I do wonder whether you think there's any way that physics could turn out which would impact your credence in this sort of thing.
Yeah. So I do occasionally find myself sparring with other panpsychist colleagues who think that it's really a significant fact that the ultimate physical ontology may turn out to be, something very, very big rather than lots of very, very small things.
Right.
Either a small number of very extensive fields, or the universe as a whole, or you can take this back to Spinoza or Schopenhauer, who space-time is the one substance, or something like that.
Right.
And I don't want to rule out that these would have really interesting results that would be worth exploring. But I guess I do think that, well, I mentioned a kind of a scale, of from the brain, subsystems within the brain, to neurons, to molecules, to atoms, to subatomic particles. And the thing is, I think that a lot of that hierarchy is still gonna, that's a well-evidenced, clearly present structure in the world. And that's gonna still be there, even if subatomic particles are somehow like abstractions from a giant field that pervades the universe, or that is the universe.
Right.
And in particular, these, what we think of as smaller parts, still exhibit a certain kind of ontological priority over the larger parts, in that they can survive dispersion. So, my brain is made of a bunch of molecules, and the molecules continue to be molecules, independently of my brain. If you removed them, they wouldn't sort of cease to be the molecules that they are. I mean, they might get denatured over time by the temperature or whatever.
Right.
But my brain would be gone. So it looks like my brain, as a complex whole, is dependent on these simpler parts coming together, and they in turn seem to be dependent on simpler parts coming together. Yeah. And I guess I'm inclined to think that we'll make more headway, at least to understanding like the us end of this this spectrum, how the human mind relates to its parts, if we kind of focus on that, even if, when you get really far down to the ultimate level, things get very weird.
So what would you be attributing the fundamental phenomenal properties to on a view like that? So, I mean, are you saying, maybe I'm misunderstanding you, but it sounds like what you're saying is, well, it could just be molecules instead of particles, or?
So I guess what I'm thinking is, it may be, for instance, that ultimately there's only one subject in some suitably fundamental sense of subject, just the field, maybe the electromagnetic field, or maybe the universe as a whole, or something, and it instantiates a lot of phenomenal properties, structured by a lot of very fine-grained instances of some small palette of phenomenal relations, enough to generate the complexity that we observe.
Yeah, I see.
And within that kind of sea or ocean of consciousness, there will be, you kind of say, like little, I don't know, vortexes, little structures that hold together and kind of undergo changes in their relations to each other. And we are one of those vortexes, but it looks like we're made of smaller vortexes.
Right.
I don't know if vortex is a useful analogy, but
Descartes loved vortexes, so sure.
You did.
So it sounds like what you're saying is the distinction between what's sometimes called cosmopsychism and micropsychism is not really all that important for what you're interested in.
That's the opinion that I've come to. Yeah, I think a lot of the same problems will kind of reappear in different guises, whichever one you pick. And I should say, it's not just about scale. So Susan Schneider has pointed out that on a lot of models of the fundamental physics, time itself is kind of an emergent property. So what is really most fundamental is non-temporal, and it's not at all clear whether consciousness can be non-temporal. Right. So that would be, if that works, then that would potentially be a good argument against the letter of panpsychism. But I guess I kind of think, look, if consciousness appears right when time appears, at the level of whatever the smallest temporally extended entities are, and then compounds up from that level up to us, that's still kind of keeping most of what seems significant to me about panpsychism, as opposed to physicalism, as opposed to dualism, and so on.
So why do you? I mean, I know that thing that you're referring to by Susan. I do wonder why you think that time is required for micro experiences, especially the ultimately simple ones. I could get why it'd be required for us or more complex ones, but why do you think it's a requirement of consciousness, period?
I mean, I don't have a particularly firm view on that. Perhaps it's not. Perhaps the really fundamental things have a sort of atemporal, qualitative awareness. Historically, I guess people have attributed something sort of like that to God in a lot of systems. And God is very different from us, but usually it would be weird to think God is not conscious. But at the same time, other people have, it's been kind of traditional to think of time as a key feature of consciousness. Sometimes with a kind of contrast with, space is a defining feature of physical objects, time is a defining feature of consciousness. Right. So yeah, I don't know which of those would be correct. My point was that even if you thought that time was required for consciousness.
Right. So even if it were sort of, like you said, defeated the letter of it, it wouldn't defeat the spirit of it. So
that's my feeling. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Interesting. Yeah, because I always have I'm a kind of flat-footed consciousness guy, and I'm seeing people saying they hate type B physicalists in the chat right now, by the way.
Okay.
Like, I'm guilty of being hated by them, but I find the very idea of consciousness just at the fundamental level hard to really understand, because there's no sophistication to it. There's no and it's just permanent. It's all, it never changes. It's just like, you know, this electron has a conscious experience, which exists as long as the electron exists.
I mean, there might be matching like changes in energy levels. Yeah, that would be kind of one of the questions that I feel like I'm not well positioned to directly address. But to the extent that the properties of electrons change, that would presumably correspond with some sort of change in their very simple consciousness.
Right. So being attracted and repelled are two different states. I guess Hedda has some things sort of along those lines, right?
Yeah.
I'm going to talk to her about that later, actually.
Okay.
So, I mean, yeah. Okay. So I guess that's not as bad as I thought it was then, because I thought it was that your view was just that there was like this permanent static sort of states, which never, but as long as you allow some change, I guess I could sort of understand it. So how, let's talk about experiential inheritance and how that's going to help us with these combination problems. Because actually that was one part of the book where I found myself probably the most skeptical, was when you applied it, not just the idea of experience to inheritance, or EI as you call it. I've sort of got my mind around that, I think, but to the way in which this was supposed to help us with the combination problem.
Okay.
So first, can you tell us about how you think about inheritance in this way, and then we'll talk about how it applies.
Yeah. So as I said, you know, part of the combination problem is this worry about subjects, about how does something that's me relate to these other things that aren't me, and it kind of looked to me like the answer has to be something along the lines of, well, they're not me individually, but they are me collectively. That this distinction between the one and the many is not that metaphysically deep. And this is a view that, you know, has already been defended in, you know, non-mind related metaphysics.
Right.
It's often called composition as identity, or composition as something like identity or something analogous to identity. The thought being that, you know, that what we call one whole is in some sense just the very same bit of reality as the set of what we call its parts. It's just that we either count it as one thing or we divide it into many things. It's the same reality, whichever way you slice it.
Right.
And that seems to work for most of the fundamental physical properties. You know, the mass of the object is the same whether you count it as one object or whether you count it as 2/2 or 3/3 or whatever.
Right.
And so I thought, well, I'm kind of being pushed towards wanting consciousness to be susceptible of that same kind of approach, that it's the same mass of consciousness, you know, going on here, and we can either attribute the bits of it to the parts, we can kind of carve it up like that, or we can count it as one, and then, you know, I'm something like that one thing that has all those experiences together. And yeah, so a theorem that kind of falls out of that approach is experience inheritance, that, you know, whenever some part of an object has an experiential property, that thing also has that experiential property. And there have to be certain caveats to that, right. Just like there have to be caveats to talking about, you know, electrical charge inheritance, or any analogous principle. But that basic idea that it's the same reality whichever way you slice it, is the idea that I was trying to get across there.
Yeah, I mean, that's very interesting. So, I mean, some of this is going to hinge on what you think of as a part and what you think of as a whole. And so you want to include, like, obviously your brain as a whole, but you generally as a whole. But like, for instance, you and I are not a whole. Or would you count that you and I together as a whole, or an ersatz whole or something like that? Or do you make this kind of distinction?
So this is one of the reasons why I think the book is admittedly a kind of a dense book, is that I think the nature of wholes is one of these topics where there are conflicting intuitions to address. and you kind of have to say different things in different chapters to make sense of them. So one really obvious and basic observation is that, sometimes the whole is more than the sum of its parts, and sometimes it's not. Right. So, the stuff together here is integrated in a way that allows it to work together in a way that, you and I are largely not. And so that's going to make a big difference to how the minds combine over here and how the minds combine between the two of us. And I try to kind of bring that up by talking about structure-specific wholes. I am a structure-specific whole in the sense that I am defined by a certain structure, and I would cease to exist if that structure ceased to obtain among my parts. But I also think that at the level of really fundamental metaphysics, there's another sort of whole that needs to be talked about that I think are called aggregates, which are the things for which composition as identity really does hold. They are just the many parts considered as one. And so that they'll have different persistence conditions is one of the key differences. If we talk about, the whole here in the sense of an aggregate, then if it were dispersed to, wide, my head was blown up and all the parts went to different places, the aggregate still exists. It's still, it's scattered now. It's one piece here, one piece there, but it still exists because it's just them considered as one.
Right.
And part of the reason why we have to think about aggregates at the really fundamental level is that the difference between, highly structured wholes and wholes that aren't structured like that, I think is susceptible to Socrates' objections.
Right.
Yes, me and you are not related in the same way that my two cerebral hemispheres are, but we're related in some of the same ways. At the very least, we're currently, happily communicating information in ways that is updating the structure of my brain to match certain structures of yours.
Right.
And if you just added more and more of that by imperceptibly increasing steps, you would get to a point where, we would be just as integrated as two halves of a brain. And at that point, our, the mind that we combine to make would be something like an individual human mind, even though right now it's something much more like a widely dispersed aggregate. And that, that's kind of what I try to, the step from one to the other is what I try to go through in the final chapter with my perhaps slightly macabre thought experiment.
When two become one.
Yes.
I don't know if this is sort of a tangent, but do you read fiction at all ever?
I try to. I wish I read more fiction than I do, but I've read a fair amount. Yes.
There's a recent book by a woman named Anne Leckie. I'm not sure it's but she has a character in there that's a composite of many hundreds of minds that have joined together. And so she actually, that's one of the things that people really like about this series of books of hers, is that she really tries to imagine this thought experiment that it's a version of it, I think, but it's actually a character in the book, and she tries to tell it from their point of view. And it's very interesting.
Yeah. I mean, there would be a lot to write if you ever tried to do a systematic history of composite minds in fiction.
Yeah.
Because there are cases like the one you just talk about with Anne Leckie. There are the various menacing hive minds that you find kind of pursuing the protagonists around the Star Trek universe.
Exactly.
There's various sorts of telepathy that often kind of push at the boundaries between minds and potentially kind of blur them. And I will say a lot of the depiction of composite mind in fiction is often driven less by the reality of what it actually would be like, and more by, sublimated political anxieties,
right?
About mass consumption and so on. But that's definitely something that I will have to look into, because I do love seeing this kind of thing explored in fiction.
Yeah, I'll send you the link to it if you're interested. But going back to the main issue, I mean, I guess part of what I was thinking about was that taking quantum mechanics seriously, like there are senses in which you and I are a whole, a structured whole even, because we've been in the same room together. And so therefore our atoms are entangled, particles are entangled. And that in a sense means that we are no longer fully separate. But so that's more than just an aggregate, wouldn't you say? Or, I mean, once you start bringing in sorts of things.
Yeah. And so so certainly an aggregate is not defined as, having no structure.
Oh,
it's just defined independently whether there's structure or not.
Oh, I thought it was merely like you could, it's like the left half of my hand and that pine tree over there. It was more of like that sort of thing.
No. So an aggregate is meant to be the very inclusive category that includes those sorts of wholes, along with cases where there is more structure.
I see.
But what distinguishes them is that they're not defined by the structure. So they don't have persistence conditions that relate to the maintenance of that structure.
Right. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, good. All right. So, so when we're talking about slicing up the individual components and attributing the same properties to it, so you want to say, well, like you're hearing the sound of my voice right now, but so is this neuron in your head is also hearing the sound of my voice. I wonder how far that extends, because you focus a lot on the brain. But I'm wondering about your liver and your kidney, and do those figure in? So one question that I have, and this is something I've talked about with Philip before, when I was talking with him and Bernardo, and Philip was very brain focused, and Bernardo was like, no, it's the whole organism. And of course, there's other background disagreements, but that was one thing that came up, and I do wonder what your view about that kind of
So so as you say, there's kind of two questions here. So one question is, how much is it just a brain story? Our minds, to what extent are they just brain-based, and to what extent does the broader peripheral and enteric nervous system actually contribute to what we think of as our mind, our mental lives? And then there's the question of, whichever of those models is true, how does that, what does that look like in a constitutive panpsychist framework?
Right.
So I'm fairly agnostic, I think, about the first question. I'm wary particularly of like a causal constitutive fallacy, kind of running too much from, oh, this thing causally affects my mental life, to saying this thing is a part of my mental life.
Right.
And so suppose that we take, some part of me that's almost certainly not a constituent of my mental life. Maybe my kidneys, I don't know. I don't know enough about kidneys for this really, but I think a panpsychist ought to say that the kidneys are conscious, kind of just like everything else. They're probably, closer to the consciousness of something like a plant than to that of a brain-endowed organism. And that consciousness that they have is a component of all the consciousness stuff going on in my body, but it might make relatively little contribution to the consciousness that I report when I talk to you, the consciousness that's within the scope of my introspective mechanisms. And so some similar questions arise when people think about pregnancy. There's a sense in which the developing fetus is a part of the parent's body, certainly to some extent biologically. It's got a shared circulatory system.
Right.
And you might think that towards the end, at least, there's consciousness going on in the developing brain. And so you might say, sure, that's an element of the total conscious goings on within this organism, but it's not connected in the right ways to the brain for it to fall within the purview of the introspective mechanisms that generate the reports, the reflection by which the parent can say, here's what I'm experiencing right now.
So I guess this is maybe an area where you do disagree with some other panpsychists, because I don't know if that generally they want to say the liver or kidney is conscious. Like is the chair conscious? I mean, are spoons conscious? What I've understood mostly is that the answer is no. Those things have conscious parts, but they are not, the whole is not conscious in any way. But I'm hearing you sounds like you're saying yes.
Yeah, so I'm a universalist panpsychist. I believe in unrestricted phenomenal composition.
I see.
And Philip Goff has also defended unrestricted phenomenal composition in print. I don't know if it's his current view, but it's certainly not, for instance, Hedder's view.
Right.
There are certainly some panpsychists who want to have highly restricted phenomenal composition, often because they're more sympathetic to emergentism than I am. So I mean, and I'm sympathetic to unrestricted phenomenal composition for the same reason that David Lewis is sympathetic to unrestricted composition in general. Namely, that there's no sharp boundary between the cases where it seems intuitively right to say that there's composition and the cases where it seems intuitively wrong to say that. And although, lots of things can vary across a fuzzy boundary, it's plausible that nothing really fundamental can vary.
Right.
Because fundamental things can't be analyzed as changes in degree on some underlying spectrum. And so if you think that being conscious or not is a fundamental difference, then I think, yes, vagueness considerations are going to push you towards allowing all composite things to be conscious in some sense. Although I should note, as you say, the book is not exclusively about panpsychism. So, in chapter 5, I do give a model on which there is vagueness about the boundaries of consciousness, and not all things are conscious. And one of the implications of that will be that some entities may be indeterminate. They may be neither definitely conscious nor definitely not conscious.
But you're saying on the panpsychism that you accept, that's not the case.
Exactly.
Right.
I mean, I'll still want to say about those cases that there's maybe something that's indeterminate. Like it may be indeterminate whether we should call them intelligent or not. Based on the fact that they partly match the model we have from ourselves and partly don't. Mm-hmm. But the panpsychist, I think, has to deny that vague question corresponds to the question of consciousness per se.
Yeah. So is this related to, I mean, maybe I'm drawing a connection that isn't there, but is this related to your argument about EI being a priori, that the experiential inheritance is a priori? Because it sounds, well, anyway, let me ask you, can you tell us why you think it's a priori that this is true? And then I'll figure out whether I was mistaken or not.
Sure. So let me say two things, I guess. Why is it the case that it's the same consciousness whether you count it as one whole or as many parts?
Right.
So the primary argument I give for this is a priori and is derived from a claim about the nature of composition, at least when we're talking about aggregates, that they just are the same portion of reality described in a different way. And I try to kind of motivate the thought that for that reason, there will always be some corresponding property of the whole for any property of the parts. It won't always be the same property.
Right.
So my kind of go-to example is like I take a bunch of circles and I arrange them in a square shape. I can say that this whole I've made is the very same thing as all of these circles together. It's not circular, but they are. So there's that difference in properties, right. But it does have corresponding properties. It has the fine-grained shape properties that are like that its edge has this kind of circular contours to it. And conversely, the parts aren't square, even though the whole is, but they do collectively have a corresponding property, namely being arranged, in a square pattern relative to each other. And so the thought is, given that it's the same portion of reality either way, there must be corresponding properties. And if the properties in question are fundamental ones that can't be analyzed into any more basic terms, then the only possible corresponding property would be that very same property.
Right.
So that's the attempt I make to give an a priori case for it. I do also say in chapter 3 that there might be ways of giving more a posteriori arguments. There might be some other routes to the same conclusion. Part of me kind of trying to hedge my bets a bit.
Right. But you're most attracted to the a priori version because of, I mean, a lot of it had to do with just thinking about composition and sort of applying lessons there to consciousness.
Yeah, exactly. And I guess, part of me is motivated by, I guess, kind of reacting against, or I mean, using as a useful jumping off point, some of the work about eliminativism regarding wholes. So, some philosophers have said, wholes don't exist. There's just, the fundamental particles or whatever there is at the ultimate level, arranged in certain ways. There's no such thing as tables. There's no such thing as coffee mugs.
Yeah, table-wise, yes.
Exactly. Particles arranged table-wise. And they give an argument for that, essentially along the following lines, it looks to me. They start by assuming that the whole is something different from its parts. And then they say, well, if it's something different, then we should only admit it into our ontology if it has a job to do. Mm-hmm. And the thing is, wholes largely don't have a job to do because any job they would do is already done by their parts. So Trenton Merrick's talks a lot about, you throw a baseball at the window shatters. Well, what is responsible for that? If you have, simples arranged baseball-wise, their properties, both intrinsic and relational, will explain why the window shatters. You don't need to add a baseball in there. And so he says, therefore, there are no baseballs. And I think that's like a reductio ad absurdum of treating the whole and the parts as two different things, thinking that we have to independently assign properties to them. So I think, look, if an argument has led me to say there's no such thing as baseballs, I should reconsider the steps that led me to that point. And in particular, if I end up denying the existence of baseballs because I wanted a baseball to be an independent reality from the parts that make it up, then maybe I should just abandon that expectation. I should just say, no, the baseball just is the simples arranged baseball-wise.
Right, and has the same powers that they do.
Exactly.
I mean, it's interesting because you can see like a similarity between like Jae-gon Kim's causal drainage argument. Mm-hmm. So if you think that if you think that we're gonna have like the mental properties do any work, but they're constituted or identical to or whatever, functionally realized by these physical properties, then those are the things that really do the work. And so it sounds like you're going to give us roughly the same sort of response in that case as well. That's a reductio of thinking that these things are, well, the functional property and the realizer are distinct or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, maybe it's not a reductio of thinking that they are distinct in some sufficiently thin sense.
Right.
But you can't separate them too much. You can't start treating them as kind of independent matters. The functional property perhaps is not strictly identical to any of the realizer properties, but it's also clearly not an extra thing. It is dependent on them in such a way that I would want to say, inherits their causal efficacy.
Right.
And I want to be able to say something similar about consciousness, something similar about wholes in general. And I mean, the reason why I've sometimes qualified composition as identity as composition as something very close to identity is that the strict identity statements often become problematic, for instance, for modal reasons to do with persistence conditions.
Right.
But the kind of guiding intuition that we're not adding extra things, we're just reorganizing how we think about the same things. I think that's worth holding on to.
Yeah, interesting. So I want to circle back around to the inheritance idea here, because it's more than you just inherit the phenomenal properties of the parts, but it's what happens to the subjects? You don't inherit the subjectness, the subjects. You just inherit their phenomenal properties. Is that how it works, or how exactly are we thinking of the relation between subjects and phenomenal experiences, and how do those inheritance properties work?
So So one of the tricky things here, and I know I keep sort of saying this, is that it depends a lot on how you think of subjects.
Right. I was thinking of the metaphysical notion, but
yeah. Okay. So, I mean, in that sense, I guess I would say something like, the parts are subjects. That's what it means for them to have phenomenal properties. And the whole is a subject. That's what it means for it to have phenomenal properties. And so, yeah, it doesn't really make sense to talk about the whole inheriting the subjecthood of the parts, but it is, if it is the parts, subject to some caveats, then that's something like it inheriting. I mean, it is a subject, and it is just them.
I guess, how do you get the U-level subject?
Mm-hmm.
So I guess what you're saying is that the U-level subject really just is a bunch of micro subjects. But it also sounds like what you're saying is, no, the U-level subject is something over and above the micro level subject. So that's, I guess, what I'm getting hung up on.
Right. So I want to deny the over and above thing. I want to say that the me level subject is nothing over and above the micro level subject. At the same time, the me level subject has some really interesting properties, like, say, self-awareness and memory, that gives me this autobiographical sense of myself as continuing over time.
Did you say silver-awareness?
Sorry, I said self-awareness.
Oh, I heard silverware. Sorry. Okay. Yes.
So a silver-awareness maybe for certain artificial intelligences made of silver circuitry. But no.
So self-awareness, right?
Self-awareness, okay. And I do want to say that is ultimately going to be traceable to some relational fact about the microsubject. The fact that they stand in the right sort of relations to enable them collectively to be self-aware. In the book, I end up kind of talking about these at different places, because I think when you want to discuss self-awareness, you're going to get lost in the details if you're still really focusing on micro subjects at the micro level. Just like, a physicalist, I take it, doesn't have to explain the mechanisms that allow the brain to be self-aware in terms of atoms. Ultimately, it does boil down to the atoms. Right. But if you look at the atom scale, you won't be able to see the structure that generates self-awareness.
Yeah. So I guess maybe I'm falling prey to the baseball atoms thing. I guess I'm not sure how the U-level subject ends up being a subject. In the metaphysical sense, I can see how it's a subject in the other senses, the psychological sense and so forth. But so first of all, maybe I should just ask you to say what you mean by the metaphysical sense.
Sure. So I think that when people talk about the subject or the self or the me, sometimes what they have in mind is what I call a persona, something defined by the psychological traits that make you unique, that make you distinctively yourself. People will often talk a lot about memory here, but also about your personality, your values. And you can kind of get people to have these intuitions by talking about thought experiments where, maybe I die, but all the information from my brain is uploaded or downloaded into some other person or system. And that system will think in the same way as me, it will have the same memories. It will, say, hello, this is Luke here. And so one way of thinking about the subject is that the subject is what has survived into this new body there. But I think people also have the intuition sometimes that the me is sort of something very basic that lies beneath all of my changing experiences and thoughts. It's the thing that allows there to be any experiences and thoughts at all. And it would, and I could survive even losing my memories and losing my personality. And I separate those two in the book because they put very different explanatory demands on an account of, of where you get a subject. How do you explain the existence of a subject? Because one of them, will focus on rich information processing, but won't have a requirement that subjects be fundamental or kind of metaphysically heavyweight, and the other one will kind of be the other way around.
Right.
But maybe I can just ask, do you see when you say that you don't see how the composite thing is a subject, do you see how it gets phenomenal properties?
Well, through the inheritance, right? Just
Yeah.
so that was part of, maybe that's where I'm getting hung up on, because yeah, I guess I don't understand how I get the phenomenal properties I do have from the ones at the micro level. And that's, I know you have a story about confusion, and so maybe we'll end up having to talk about that in order to get through this. But I guess so what's confusing me is how I, as a subject, have the experiences I do, which ultimately are just composites of the more fundamental subjects and their experiences. It seems like what you would get is a lot of subjects and a lot of experiences rather than a subject. So so maybe I don't see how I get the phenomenal properties.
I mean, so part of the intention when arguing for experience inheritance was that it would get you a composite subject, just relying on the premise that anything that has a phenomenal property is a subject. Because if you have a phenomenal property, that means that there's something it's like to be you,
right.
And a subject is just defined as something that there is something it's like to be. And so part of the kind of the shift in view that I'm trying to go for, on which it's the same mass of consciousness, however you carve it, is to kind of say, look, and on any way of carving it, anything that appears on a given scheme of division will be a subject, because it's a thing with consciousness, and to be a subject just is to have consciousness.
Right. But yeah, so I guess I don't see why it isn't the micro subjects that are the subjects, and then maybe there's an illusion of this other thing, but maybe that's because I'm just not fully taking seriously the argument, or so I must be stuck somewhere.
Who would be subject to the illusion?
The persona or something like that, I guess.
I mean, I guess if it seems to the persona like it's a subject like that seems to me like it is being a subject, at least if it's a phenomenal illusion.
Yeah, I can see what you're saying, but because I guess I was reading too much into your definition of subject. Maybe that's what I'm doing wrong here. Because I was thinking of a subject as a thing, which has the properties. And if anything was that, it would be the fundamental elements. They're the things here. And yeah, there's a structured whole that's me, because there's all these relations between the parts, but there isn't some well, maybe it's the phenomenal unity bit. So I think I'm getting hung up on every which way I try, actually. So I just don't see, I mean, it's not that I want subject level me to be a simple, but I would like me to be a thing that has phenomenal properties. And I guess I don't see how you get that from what we're
get the thing.
Yeah. But it sounds like what you're saying is you don't need that. All you need is that there are phenomenal properties, and then ipso facto there's a subject.
I mean, it's not that I think the phenomenal properties don't belong to a thing. The thing is the brain. It's the many micro subjects together. It's the whole that they form.
Right.
I guess I'm being, in a sense, quite reductive about things.
Yeah.
This one thing just is all of these other things.
Yeah.
Partly because I think, if you want a thing that's something more than a bunch of other things together, then there might not be any things like that, anywhere, mental or physical.
Right. Well, yes, I agree. I mean, so part of this, maybe we should talk about the unity of consciousness, because you do sort of, especially phenomenal unity, not like the cognitive or functional stuff, but you do assume that that's a real property. Whereas, I guess someone like me would sort of think we have the illusion of unity at more than we have actual phenomenal unity. So how do we get, on your view, a phenomenal unity from the micro subjects to the?
Sure. Yeah. So So phenomenal unity is often introduced in a kind of an ostensive way. People will say, here are two experiences I'm currently having. Let me, attend to this fact. I'm having them together. They have a conjoint phenomenology. It's not just something it's like to see the screen and something it's like to feel my hand. It's something it's like to see the screen and feel my hand together.
Right.
And I largely, I think, follow people like Tim Bain and Barry Dainton and Dave Chalmers who have written about this relation, given somewhat different analyses of it, but take there to be some interesting relation here that kind of takes two experiences and forms them into a third experience that is the two of them had together.
Right.
And I think that if consciousness is a fundamental property, then this relation will probably have to be a fundamental relation. Because it is defined as, the relation between two things such that together they are a conscious state.
But it's not a phenomenal relation. I mean, it itself doesn't have a phenomenology, the relation.
It doesn't have a phenomenology that belongs distinctively to it, but its obtaining is always a phenomenal fact.
Because of relata.
Because of the relata and because of the change in their phenomenology from having the two of them not unified to having them unified.
You think there's a change in phenomenology from that? So if I,
at least
to a unified thing that something phenomenally changes, as opposed to just two phenomenal things are joined together.
Yeah, I think the joining together is a phenomenal joining together. It changes them from two, independent or separate experiences to a complex experience. I mean, it's a little tricky to talk about this because on lots of views here, it doesn't quite make sense to think of a single subject having two disunified experiences. So one of the theses that people debate is, must the subject experiences all be unified? So it might be that when the two experiences aren't unified, that's a reason for saying that they don't belong to the same subject.
Right.
And so I do think, though, that if this is a fundamental relation, then, and if panpsychism is true, then the most natural way to fit it into the world is as one of the physical fundamental relations. That is, phenomenal unity is the kind of intrinsic nature of, I don't know, one of the interactions, or maybe just spatial distance or something like that.
Yeah. Okay. So.
And maybe if I can just add.
Yeah.
So.
Sorry.
So I think part of what may be seeming problematic to you about how you get the macro subject is something like the feeling, well, if each part of me is a subject and I've got all of their experiences together, I still don't have, a big phenomenal field like I experience,
right.
in which all of those experiences are parts. Right. That is, I don't have these experiences phenomenally unified with one another. And I think it's at least a live possibility that there could have been a universe on which that happened, a universe with lots of micro subjects that never become phenomenally unified. But I think that would be very different from our own universe. The fact that each of us has phenomenally unified experience indicates that somehow phenomenal unity is established. And given the assumptions I just discussed, it's probably going to be one of the fundamental physical relations. And if that's the case, then it's actually there, so to speak, from the beginning. It doesn't have to be added at a certain point in the creation of the brain, but it's actually part of the background conditions that enable the brain or any other physical structure to come together. Yeah. So maybe you can take me as offering in response to your worry about how to get an actual subject with a single unified experience. If that really is needed, then I'm happy to build it in to the fundamental architecture of the universe.
Yeah, I see. Interesting. I guess part of it also is that I feel like for someone like me that likes to approach things from like a kind of higher order theory point of view, which I know we disagree on, and that's fine. But I do find very compelling the idea that that phenomenal consciousness is for me, that it's that when I have an experience, it's not just there, but it's presented to me in a certain way, like it's from my point of view. There's something that's like for me to have it. And I guess I feel like if there were a bunch of me's or tiny subjects, that would be the way it was presented. And it isn't. So this is a little, it's related to the idea that, you know, introspectively, things don't seem like a bunch of little things, but from the subject point of view. So it doesn't seem like there's a bunch of subjects. It seems like it's my experience, not a bunch of different subjects' experience. And so I mean, maybe this is why I was thinking confusion is going to play a role here, but I don't know. So what do you think about that kind of, you know, that the phenomenal consciousness presents itself as being for the subject?
Yeah. So I want to agree with the basic thought that, yeah, it's somehow it's like built into conscious experience that it has this for me-ness,
right?
Or whatever we call it, a sense of mindness. But I don't think that mindness is kind of guaranteed to kind of track all of the metaphysical facts about who it is in fact for and relay them to each of the subjects that it's for. So I think, for instance, that you talked about, I think, like hearing a voice, and there's also some neuron that's having that experience, or more plausibly, you know, an assemblage of neurons,
right? Some
part of me. So I think the view that you end up having to kind of hold, if you want to combine minds, is that there is this one experience of hearing this voice. It belongs to me, and it belongs to this part of me. And it has built into it this sense of being for me, being mine. But what that means is that for every subject who experiences it, it is experienced, you know, as belonging to them.
Right.
And I think that's
even when the thems are different.
Even when the thems are different, each of the thems will feel this is mine, and they'll be right. You know, I'm not saying that this is an illusion.
Right.
I'm just saying that this is not omniscience, so to speak.
Right.
And I think that there's a separate story to tell about how do I form my judgments of self and other. You know, what is it that makes me feel like some experience, or more broadly, some action or some event is mine or is someone else's? And I think that has a lot more to do with like not so much the basic metaphysical factor, who actually has it, but about the volitional dynamics, how it relates to my will.
Right.
You know, you can kind of trick people into thinking an action is theirs if it's the exact same action that they were willing at that moment.
Right.
And in a sense, you know, all the parts of me are subject to this sort of illusion, in that, you know, in good cases, all the parts of me are on the same page and they have a unified plan, and that makes them all feel like, oh, it's just all the one of us, so to speak. Yeah. But sometimes that does break down, and then you do start to get this phenomenology of alienation and dissociation.
Right. So do you think the mindness goes all the way down to the fundamental level, like for the electrons? Is it true?
I'm inclined to think so. Although, of course, then we do have to start, you know, unpacking. There are different ways in which something can seem mine. I don't want to build in, you know, a tendency to reflection, or, you know, the capacity to form the concept of myself. But I'm happy to think that if this really is a built-in element of conscious experience as such, then it's that's present all the way down. I'm happy to say that.
You need something like Chalmers's view that there's acquaintance, and acquaintance carries with it also acquaintance with the acquaintance, or something like that. That's somehow built into it. Or
yeah, exactly.
It sounds like it's going to start getting more complicated fundamental properties at the micro level.
Well, not necessarily. I mean, I think part of the idea of acquaintance, and likewise part of the idea of like the reflexive kind of self-consciousness of self-consciousness, for people who like that idea, is that it's, you know, each layer of self there is not an extra thing. It's just that the the experience itself is of itself, and thereby it's of itself being of itself, but that's all kind of packed in. And that the complexity only comes when you have evolved, a brain that can unpack that, formulate it into sentences, and connect it with memories and form plans and so on.
I guess it still seems to me a bit introspectively puzzling that I don't have access to the composite nature of the subject. It doesn't seem like what I get. Maybe this comes out of the reflexivity bit, but it doesn't seem like I have awareness for myself, for that self, for itself, for those selves. For it seems introspectively not like that.
Sure. I mean, so the verbal expression of mindness is tricky, because in a sense I'm trying to kind of separate mindness as this special quality from the like referential machinery of picking out a particular subject. Right. Yeah. Precisely, it's not this experience for this and this experience for that. All of them have mindness, so all of them are experienced by me as mine.
But I guess what I'm saying, what I'm done to cut you up, but I guess what I just occurred to me is what I'm thinking is that that's a phenomenal property of the experience, and so should be present in the me level experience. But you don't find it there, and so if it is phenomenally manifest, and there's a bunch of them there, and you don't find them, then
I think I guess I sort of want to say that it is present. But part of what I sort of try to motivate is the thought, we've never been anything other than what we are. If we are in fact a huge assemblage of many minds together, then that's all that we've ever been, and that's what we were talking about when we formed these these impressions of mindness and what consciousness is like. So I sort of wanted to see if at least see if I can think through the idea that this is what it's like to be many experiences at once. Is it possible for us to just take a 5-minute break at all?
Yeah, if you're willing to continue, that's absolutely fine. Yeah.
Sure. Let me just come back in a couple of minutes.
Okay.
Thanks.
I'll whistle Dixie while we're doing that. All right. No. I got glitter on me from Kagan's or a project. Oh, is it back on? Oops.
Hello.
All right, hello. If you have to leave, that's no problem. I don't
No,
want
I just had to take a quick break.
Okay, cool.
Issues.
Cat issues.
You may see his tail pass backwards and forwards here.
Yeah, cool. So, I mean, I did want to, because I guess this is getting to issues at least in the same ballpark as what I think of as an objection to this sort of view, which you deal with extensively in the book. So I did kind of want to bring it up, which is that introspectively, if you have a kind of revelation, and I know you have a paper on this too, but the hoist by your own petard. I had to look that up. I did not know what that means. So I guess that's from Shakespeare. It means, you know, blown up by your own bomb or something. I did not know that.
Yes.
But anyway, so whether the thesis of revelation is a problem for the kind of panpsychism that you want to defend. And I've pressed Philip a little bit on this, and I've always thought that it was, but your paper is very interesting and defends the idea that no, it's not. And really it's because there's like a family approach to revelation. It's not one sort of thing. But anyway, so can you tell us a little bit about revelation and how that's supposed to work?
Sure. Yeah, so revelation is the idea that being conscious tells you what consciousness is. By having an experience, you are put in a position to grasp something like its nature. Maybe not the whole nature of everything to do with it, but at least the nature of what that experiential quality is like. So, you know, when I see something red, I know what it's like to see red. I may not know everything there is to know about that, but I know what defines that experiential type. And this idea that there's some kind of genuine grasping of nature is, I think, fairly important to the arguments against physicalism.
Yeah.
And I'm sure Philip said that. He's developed that line of thought at length. But it does look like it's potentially a problem for constitutive panpsychists, because, you know, they are saying, look, when you have an experience, there's a lot going on there that you don't know about. Namely, you know, a trillion simpler experiences, or aspects of a trillion simpler experiences kind of blended together. And so what I try to do in the book, and yeah, at a bit more length in the paper, is try to diffuse this threat. In particular, I try to say, well, there's I guess a few kind of twists and turns the argument can take, but the basic idea is, yeah, you do have genuine knowledge of the nature of the complex quality. You know what it's like to see red. You know what seeing red is in general. You don't know what on this occasion gives rise to that experience. You don't have insight into what constitutes this particular instance of seeing red.
Right.
But what that means is that you are being acquainted with the nature of this quality. You are in a position that if you're acquainted with or familiar with the nature of some other things, you should be in a position to tell whether or not they are enough to explain it.
Yeah.
And that's why this kind of substantiates the argument against physicalism, because physicalism, requires us to, in some sense, know what it is about the physical that explains consciousness. And so all you need is acquaintance with the nature of, say, seeing red, to be able to evaluate, does this complicated physical arrangement, is that the right kind of thing to explain this? And that does leave it open, I think, for the constitutive panpsychist to say, the red in this case is constituted by a lot of simpler qualities, and we don't know those distinctly. We don't have, them in isolation. So in a sense, we can't actually perform this evaluation of whether they are enough to explain the redness. But we don't have the argument against panpsychism analogous to the argument against physicalism, because panpsychists, in a sense, are almost defined by saying there is something at the fundamental level that eludes our scientific grasp. There's something there that we don't have a grasp on, except that we know it's something like what we ourselves experience. So I guess
I find that pretty puzzling, because, well, for a couple of reasons. First, the argument against physicalism, because it seems like the physicalist could do the same thing and say, well, what we know is the experiential nature of the property. And that's what I think, actually. But that doesn't mean you know what its metaphysical nature is. Its metaphysical nature may be neurons or fundamental properties of atoms that are conscious. So how do you preserve, I guess one thing I was curious about is how you preserve the argument against physicalism and against this kind of move, which I was just trying to make.
Yeah.
Go ahead, yeah.
Well, so I think it's correct to say in that instance that we don't know, just through the revelation principle, we don't know the constituents or the basis of our particular experience of red on a given occasion.
Right.
What we know is what it is for an experience to be of red.
Right.
And that, I was saying, is enough for us to make arguments of the form, here's a candidate explainer. Is this the right kind of thing to explain why we would have an experience of red? And my claim essentially is that panpsychism has, you might say, a greater epistemic humility about the fundamental level, or it has a picture of the fundamental level that has more space for things that we aren't acquainted with.
Right.
In a way that kind of, I think, would in some ways defeat the motivation for physicalism. Physicalists will sometimes say things like, oh, perhaps there's some mysterious feature of the physical that we don't know about yet. But that is kind of the first step, towards something closer to panpsychism, that kind of non-standard physicalism.
Yeah, like Barbara Montero's.
Like the sort of view on which there's something else, beyond what physics says. There's something else about the fundamental nature of things that, if we understood it, would allow us to understand why we're conscious.
Right. But what I guess I'm confused about is why we need that as physicists. Why isn't it enough to say that revelation tells us about the experiential nature of the property, but not about what metaphysically it is? And then it's a further separate question about what that is, and you can give arguments that it's physical or not. But I'm not sure why revelation by itself then has any relevance to physicalism.
So I think maybe we're drawing slightly different distinctions here.
Okay.
So I was distinguishing between the particular things that constitute a given instance of an experience, like me seeing red right now. And I was contrasting that with the property of having an experience of redness in general.
Right.
And it sounds like you are trying to pull apart two aspects of that second thing. an experiential nature of the property in general and a metaphysical nature of the property in general.
Right. Yeah.
And I guess I'm not sure. I'm not quite sure what that means really, because I would have thought that, it's an experiential property, so its experiential nature just is its nature. That's what it is to be an experiential property, is to feel a certain way. So I guess I'm sort of, I'm not sure what the.
Well, why aren't you doing the same thing? I mean, I see your point here, but why isn't it the same for you, given that the ultimate nature of it is composites in this way?
So because I take that to be a claim about the bases of a particular instance.
Right.
So one of the things that this does commit me to is the idea that you could have different beings in different possible worlds that all have the same experiential quality, that all see redness.
Right.
But one of them is perhaps a Cartesian soul, for which the redness property is not grounded in anything else. That's just the basic fact about it.
Right.
And maybe for us, the panpsychist thinks it's grounded in a certain set of simpler experiences together. Maybe in another universe, it's grounded in a different set of simple experiences together. And each of these has to be such that a subject who fully grasped the simple experiences could tell that they generate redness. That link, it has to be intelligible, but it may be a many-one relation.
So how is it? But I must be.
But I think the key thing that maybe is dividing us is that my distinction is between particular instances, concretely,
right,
and the property as a universal. And it sounds like you're trying to pull apart two aspects of the property as a universal.
I was thinking of the instance, like a particular instance of experiencing red. So I do think some kind of revelation thesis is true about that thing's experiential nature, but I don't think that tells you. I mean, certainly doesn't tell you that if idealism is true or not. It doesn't tell you whether panpsychism is true or not. Just knowing what it's like to see red in a given particular instance doesn't reveal the metaphysical basis of that particular experience. But otherwise, all you have to do is introspect and rule out idealism. But that we can't do that.
So I guess I think that it puts you in a position to evaluate candidate explanations. It doesn't tell you what the specific explanation of that instance is, but it puts you in a position to evaluate candidate explanations if you fully understand them.
Yeah, I guess I don't see that move.
Okay.
I mean, I guess that's where you just say conceivability arguments and things like that. That's where the evaluation of those candidates comes in.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. So we disagree there. So okay, because the reason I brought up Revelation was that I thought that this is an argument against panpsychism. But the way you phrased it just now was very careful, obviously, because you didn't say we know everything there is to know about it. We just know what it's like to see red, which could turn out to be a composite thing on your view. So then what we know is like what it's like to have a composite experience. But I hear like other versions of this that are much more specific and say things like, well, Revelation tells us everything there is to know about red in the experiencing of it. We know everything there is to know about it. And you can't endorse that.
Well, I think again it matters a lot whether that is everything there is to know about my particular experience of red right now, which is a concrete thing, has a spatiotemporal location, and it arises from particular bases and from particular causes, or if it means everything there is to know about the property in general, which usually I take it there's a restriction to everything that is essential to it, everything that is, that defines what that sort of experience is. Because this usually goes with, quite a fairly narrow view of what that is, namely that it's feeling like this. It's this kind of phenomenal quality. I mean, I think Philip has sort of a maneuver here where he says, look, if you think that there's something else that's essential to the property in general of seeing red, I'm just talking about the aspect that we do grasp via this revelation, the aspect that we are acquainted with. That's what I mean by the reddish, the reddishness of red. And you can kind of iterate it a few times, I guess, the reddish quality of the reddishness of red. But you want to say there's something that you're acquainted with. And I think that even if it's only a tiny sliver of the reality that's going on here, inside my skull, what's important is that it can still put you in a position to evaluate candidate explanations.
Doesn't it put you in a position to know that there are micro subjects?
No.
That can,
I mean, I'm not sure that I do know that there are micro subjects. I consider it the most likely hypothesis, but I am in the position of having to hypothesize.
I guess what I'm asking is, why doesn't the revelation thesis commit you to knowing that? And since you don't, isn't that a strike against the view?
So, right. So the revelation thesis commits me to knowing everything that's essential to the property, in the abstract of seeing red, of having that kind of experience.
Right.
But
not about the instance.
Not about the instance. And so I think that the essence of that property is, in a certain sense, multiply realizable, multiply constitutable. It could arise from certain combinations of micro experiences or from certain other combinations, or it could exist all by itself. I don't think it could arise purely from non-phenomenal facts in any concatenation.
So you really have to deny even the conceivability of anti-zombies or shombies. And I don't really see an argument for that, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, this is, I guess, going to go back to our earlier dispute about what's built into saying nothing but.
Right.
I mean, it may also turn somewhat on what we mean by physical. So I said earlier that panpsychists see themselves as kind of filling in the intrinsic natures of physical things.
Right.
And so there is a sense in which, maybe it is possible to conceive of schmombies. They're just physical and they're conscious. But maybe by doing so, what you're conceiving of is things that have, the full nature of what in our universe is physical. They have, all of this that I've got.
And that's cheating because they have a...
Well, that's going to turn physicalism into a sort of panpsychism.
Yeah.
Well, it will make physicalism into panpsychism if panpsychism is true in the actual universe.
Right. Yeah, no, I think that the way I conceive of them is they don't have that. They're just physical, but they're conscious, like in a non-fundamental way. Like in a good old-fashioned, it's just the brain sort of way. But yeah, all right, I can see that's a complicated slog, and we don't need
when you're stipulating the fundamentality, I think you're stipulating something about like the metaphysical dependence relations. And I think that involves you in making claims not just about the particular possible world that you're imagining, but more broadly about how other possible worlds relate to it.
Yeah, I guess I don't see that, but that's not.
I'm happy to agree to disagree.
Yeah, totally. Everyone disagrees with me, so that's fine. But I still don't. I guess. Yeah, exactly. You have it even worse than I do, I think, with this combined mind stuff. Which, but you do. By the end, it's hard to disagree because you do such a good job defending it. But
thank you.
I still don't see why the revelation thesis doesn't apply to a particular instance. So I guess I'm curious why you restrict it only to the property type, as opposed to my given instantiation of that type. Like when I experience the red, shouldn't I know everything that, by forming a pure, direct, phenomenal concept, whatever one you like, I think you like pure and some people like direct, whatever. So you form that kind of concept, there it is. I know everything that there is about this is, but you can't say that. Or is this where the confusion is going to come in? So I guess I'm waiting for confusion to play a role.
So there are these other epistemic intuitions that we have a sort of special contact with our particular experiences, that we're aware of them in a especially direct way.
Right.
I guess I don't see a reason for thinking that this is going to extend to like a grasp of their full essence or all their properties. I'd be open to hearing an argument along those lines. And to a certain extent, I will own up that I'm, my goal here is sort of to find a consistent corner of logical space. And I'm not sure if it will necessarily be the best motivated one overall. But I think there is a consistent corner here. But you're right that there's this other thing that's often bundled in with talk of revelation, that if I'm having an experience, I should be able to kind of fix on it and know it. And so it probably is useful to talk a bit about confusion. And we've already talked a bit about the idea of one phenomenal quality being blended out of all these others.
Right.
And that blending is what I'm calling confusion, which again, I think is
right. It's that we can't separate them. They're blended in a way that's not separable.
Exactly. So, and I want to insist that we are having all of the experiences, but we're having them together in this way that kind of doesn't tell us how many of them there are. And I do take this from Leibniz and Spinoza to some extent, who are very into this idea that the mind has many, many very simple perceptions, but it's kind of got them all blurred together. Mm-hmm. And I think that is usefully thought of to some extent in attentional terms. So I have, a lot of experiences, but there's a limit to how much I can attend to them individually. I can kind of shine the spotlight of attention on certain kind of groupings, but I can't kind of penetrate more finely than that. And then that puts a limit on which phenomenal qualities I can know the essence of, or the natures. So I'm using nature and essence synonymously. I probably should pick one and stick with it.
Or pick both and stick with both.
Okay.
So because this is another question, because attention is a functional notion. It's one of the easy problems, right? So it's not a phenomenal thing. So I am confused a little bit about how something that's not phenomenal can play this kind of role on your view.
So, I mean, I think when Dave distinguishes the hard problem and the easy problems, I think he does, recognize that a lot of the times, something that we have a word for, like attention or like really consciousness itself, is going to be a word that kind of straddles both sides. So there's a functional notion of attention and there's a phenomenal notion of attention, just like there's a functional notion of awareness and a phenomenal notion of awareness. And so you can kind of pull them apart if you really want to just focus on, say, the functional notion. If you want to study that and not have to worry about phenomenology and get these metaphysicians off my back, just do the cognitive science of attention. But I think it would be a mistake to assume that what's going on there is that there are two different kind of separable properties, and you're just studying the one and not the other. I think it maybe makes more sense to say something like the functional notion of attention is a functional role, and in us, the playing of that role is by phenomenal dynamics. And so what we in everyday language, what we mean when we say attention is the way that the attentional role is played within phenomenal consciousness. And that's going to be kind of a notion that blends together some of the phenomenal with the functional kind of skeleton. The phenomenal is what fleshes out or fills in the phenomenal outline. I guess you don't actually, do you flesh out a skeleton? I don't know.
So, but that's a high level property of the brain.
Yeah.
And so how is that blended out of, I mean, I guess, so this gets to the other thing I want to ask is how does the blending work to give me, because part of I don't know if since revelation, you want to reserve that for property types, the graspingness or whatever of phenomenal properties is their simplicity. right? That phenomenal red is simple in a sense when I focus on it. And I just don't understand how, even if you buy the entire story, which I find semi-convincing, by the way, more than I should, given that I'm not a panpsychist. But even if you buy that entire story, I don't see how that gives you, from these tiny little elements, anything that could ever amount to red. So I just don't see how and in that part of the book, I felt like I didn't get an answer to this. It's probably because I need to read it 6 more times. But so anyway, how do we get human level consciousness from the confusion, blending, all these things?
So part of what I guess I'm trying to draw on is the thought that we have some cases within our macro level consciousness where we have an experience at one time, and then maybe, and at that time, it seems like it's just one quality, doesn't come to us as composite or as having dissociable elements. And then maybe later on, we have a different experience and we realize, oh, that was an element of the previous experience. And maybe we have a third experience, and we're like, oh, that was the other element. And now we have the first experience again. And because we've kind of trained ourselves to recognize these two elements, we can be like, oh, now it actually seems phenomenologically composite to me. Right. People will talk, I mean, I think Daniel Dennett in Consciousness Explained, he talks about this with notes on a guitar.
Right.
And I don't really get that particular example because I'm terrible at recognizing notes. I'm kind of tone deaf, but people will also talk about this in terms of smells and flavors. And there's potentially there might be examples with color. There's some, I think, intuition to the effect that, that orange kind of recognizably contains red and yellow as elements. But if you just saw orange and you had never seen red and yellow, you wouldn't be able to kind of see it as having the like any redness to it or any yellowness to it.
Explain other colors like I mean, purple and orange work, but green.
Yeah. So, well, I mean, to me, I think green feels bluish and yellowish. But the primary colors, red, green, red, yellow, and blue, right. They don't seem to be blended. Sorry?
I don't get that for green, just personally. Not that it matters, but
fair enough.
But I could see how how you could. But it does seem weird to say that it's literally that they're both there as opposed to they're blended. So purple seems like a reddish blue, but it doesn't seem like red and blue.
I mean, to some extent, I may just have to kind of lean harder on the intuition here. I mean, what would it be like if you did experience red and blue together at the same location in phenomenal space? To me, the best answer seems to be purple. Yeah. I mean, color is tricky. Like, color processing is really, in some respects, it's very counterintuitive. Which colors actually combine with which other ones when you're dealing with like wavelengths and cones. And so I don't want to lean too hard on the particular examples. I think in some ways, flavor and smell is more useful just for kind of pushing this sense that sometimes we have experiences that are other things blended together, and they comprise these different elements, but we don't automatically recognize them as comprising those many elements.
Yeah, let's not even talk about yellow, but I think flavor is an interesting case because I know it's has inputs from taste and also smell, but it's an open question whether it's a unique state, multimodal sometimes they call it, which is more than just a blending of them. It becomes something else, like unique and distinct, which is formed maybe out of those two elements. But so I'm not sure if I really get the intuitions that you're leaning on here, because it sounds like what you're committed to is that if we really had, and you actually say that something like this at some point in the book, if I recall, like if we really enhance our brain in a certain way, then we would be able to separate these things out introspectively, and we would be able to say in the flavor experience, there's the taste part and there's the smell component, and that seems, I guess, yeah, to me that seems implausible, at least for flavor, given the way the brain processes that information.
Yeah, I mean, I think what I'm committed to is that, in principle, changing the internal sensitivity of the brain could allow us to differentiate elements of our experiential field, arbitrarily finely.
Mhm.
A wrinkle is that the changes themselves might transform things to the point where it's no longer the very same experience that we're now having.
Right.
It might be that, the things you have to do to my brain to allow it to, be that sensitive to like individual particles, individual molecules, that allow me to count the neurotransmitter molecules in a particular synapse. Those might change the brain so much that the experience itself is no longer the same flavor that we were having before. It'll be some different flavor. And I will, I guess, fall back on, this is at least a consistent corner of logical space. And I do like this. I forget if it made it into the book, but there's this passage in William James where he says, I find in my students an irresistible tendency to think that the taste experience of tasting lemonade, contains the lemoniness of lemon and the sweetness of sugar.
Yeah, it did make it in the book.
Okay, good. And he says it doesn't at all. It's a completely new and distinctive thing in its own right. The lemonade contains sugar and lemon, but the taste experience does not contain either of these two other taste experiences at all.
Right.
And I guess I'm sort of sitting here like, it sounds like he has many students who are very inclined towards thinking of this in blending terms. So, if we're doing this democratically, I'm on the side of the students, and it looks like I outvote William James at least. And maybe you're on his side as well. So there's
a little bit, yeah, exactly, yeah.
And I don't really know like what is a good way to resolve this kind of introspective kind of impasse. I guess to a certain extent, what I'm like, my model is that something happens to the micro experiences that turns them into the experiences that we have.
But the difficulty for me is that even if I disagree with you about purple and the lemonade or whatever, conceptually you can see the path.
Right.
But in the case of the micro experiences to red, you can't see the path. It's completely opaque how those things could blend, because obviously it's inscrutable in some sense. We don't know what they're having, but you gesture towards some things, maybe it's like universal love or, so whatever it is, it's got to be super simple. And it's just not clear how things like that could combine into anything except more complicated things like that, as opposed to a completely unrelated thing like hearing middle C, tasting chocolate, seeing red. Those are very different from me. I mean, I know your Sam Coleman line that maybe they're not so different, which I don't really buy either. But at least prima facie, hearing middle C and seeing red are very distinct. And yet, on your view, they're composed out of the same micro elements. And I just don't know how you get a path from one to the other, except for saying, well, here's some things which combine, so maybe these things too. And that looks like more like a leap than like a principled argument.
Sure. I mean, it's hard for me to know really like what is cheating and what is playing by the rules in this area.
It's philosophy. It's all cheating.
Right. I mean, part of it would be, it may be that these very simple experiences have some degree of internal differentiation, perhaps between like a that and a this, and then maybe the different modes of combination kind of recombine those elements which might be very different from each other, and get you things that are different from each other because of the different ways that they blend those differences. There's people will sometimes point out that the neurons in auditory cortex and the neurons in visual cortex are the same neurons. They're made of all the same elements.
Right, and they're doing all the same stuff.
Sorry?
And they're doing all the same stuff.
Yeah. But it might be that I think there's no clear reason why there couldn't be relatively high level differences that allow some tendency or element within that stuff to express itself differently in the one place than in the other.
Right.
Especially, given that what they are doing, even the neurons in like auditory cortex, they're doing that in the context of the rest of the brain. So, it may be that neurons in auditory cortex in isolation would have a different sort of experience than my hearing experiences. But I will freely admit there are definitely kind of gaps in the view that need to be filled, and hopefully it's a contribution, for me to bring out these points of disagreement more clearly, so that we can see, what is really at issue and what would have to be the case.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. But I guess the only reason I'm bringing this up is because the whole point I thought was to try to solve the combination problem.
Mm-hmm.
But right at the crucial point, it's like there's a gap. So it doesn't seem like how it solves the combination problem. It suggests this interesting idea about combining minds and inheriting experience, and all that stuff is great. But it doesn't show us how we could a priori derive the experience that you're having from micro experiences, mm-hmm. which, as far as I could tell, would be required to solve the combination problem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I guess on the one hand, I want to insist that I do think that if this is beyond our capacities as human beings, but if we were able to grasp all of the micro experiences, I do think that they would, it's at least a good live option, that it would then be intelligible that the way those elements blend when in the sorts of connections that they're in would turn out to be the sorts of experiences that we have.
Really? So you think you wouldn't be able to get invert cases from, like, you have the very same micro phenomenal properties but inverted?
No, I don't think so. I think that if you're working with experiential elements, and if you're working with the qualitativeness that they give you, then I don't think that they would leave wiggle room for changes in the macro experiential qualities. Yeah. Except insofar as you would have to change the way that they relate to each other, because it's clear that the structure makes a big difference. And I feel like what you're pushing on is, maybe the structure would have to make such a big difference that it would kind of break rather than just stretch the different potentialities provided by the micro level. That's possible, but I haven't been convinced of it.
It seems like you could run like a microphenomenal Mary sort of thought experiment.
Mm-hmm.
They knew only the microphenomenal properties, and still would be surprised at what it's like to see a tomato when she comes out of her room.
So I guess I do think there's a difference. So, part of what the original Mary case is bringing out is that, if she's learning physical structural facts, any amount of learning that, it doesn't look like it's going to ever get to something qualitative. It looks like it's, you can sort of picture it like on a graph. You've got something here and up on the y dimension, and more physical facts are taking you along the x dimension, but you can go as far as you want in that direction, and it just won't touch the gap. With micro-phenomenal Mary, who's, studying these simple experiences and how they combine, she's studying qualitative facts and how they generate other qualitative facts, how they generate different qualities. And there it looks like it's no longer clear that just doing more and more of that will necessarily get you to, will never get you to the particular quality of red.
Yeah.
And let me also say, if you're right, I think there's at least potentially a fallback for panpsychists to go for something like what Dave, I think, called a large palette option.
Right.
on which there's
That's like a last ditch effort, right? Where you say every experience we have is present at the phenomenal level, at the micro fundamental level.
yeah. I mean, well, okay, maybe what I guess I mean is a medium palette view,
Okay.
in which there's enough qualitatively distinct elements present at the basic level to blend all the experiences we have out of them.
Right. There's only a certain amount of particles, and if string theory is right, there's really only one kind. So it does seem like you're going to bump up against some physical facts.
Yeah. And so that's why I prefer a smaller palette, if at all possible. I mean, I think it's not super clear how small the palette is. And so I said earlier, it might be that different energy levels for an electron correspond to changes in experiential quality.
Right.
So it might not be the number of particles that matters. It might be something more to do with like the state space of their properties. And that.
I mean, isn't this like a problem for the view that there's so much wiggle room here? Because it's like the theory's unconstrained by anything really. You can basically wiggle it and bend it. You can in anything. Yeah. Well, maybe it's 4. Maybe it's 4,000. I mean, there's no principled. There's nothing that's principled which allows you to constrain it at that level.
I mean, I do definitely think that it's a cost making the palette larger. So it's not like it's wiggle room with no costs.
Okay.
And overall, like we're going to have to do like a weighing up the costs and benefits of the views. And I think every departure from the ideal of full a priori determination from a small palette of simple qualities is going to affect that cost benefit analysis. Yeah, like I don't know. I mean, is your concern that there's not enough wiggle room, or that there's too much?
Too much.
Yeah.
That there's no principled constraints. You can basically say whatever you want. I mean, maybe they love each other. Maybe they hate each other. Maybe there's one kind. Maybe there's 40 kinds. Maybe every energy state is a kind. Maybe when strings vibrate at certain levels, then that's a different phenomenon. But it just doesn't seem like there's anything which constrains what you're saying here about that microphysical level, which just seems like, well, then, yeah, it's like what's cheating and what's not cheating. Well, you can, like what?
Yeah, I can see that concern. I mean, I guess it's hard for me to feel too unconstrained, because I do think that, like, certainly once you get above the really basic level and start thinking about, if consciousness is present in the physical fundamentals, what does that mean for the distribution of consciousness and the of complex consciousness in us? In the book, I end up finding myself constrained towards a lot of views that even other panpsychists think are undesirable.
Right.
That tables are conscious and so on. So I feel like I'm operating under fairly stringent constraints there.
Right. No, I meant about the palette in particular.
At the palette, at the fundamental level, I mean, yes, there's wiggle room in part because we don't know what the fundamental physics is like, and also because the view is, accepts a certain degree of mystery to the universe. It accepts that we, just as we don't, consciousness is something where if it's someone else's, you kind of can't understand it fully. You never know what it's quite like to be a bat, and so putting consciousness at the fundamental level does put a certain level of mystery that we won't ever get away from. I think mystery is better than the kind of incomprehensibility that physicalism would have there. And like is the physicalist in a better position here with like generating red rather than some other quality? Like it's not clear that they are like constrained. It's not clear that the fundamental physics, for instance, is constrained by physicalism, or that they have any principled way of saying, if the fundamental physics, or if anything were different, here's the quality that we would experience instead.
Well, I do, I
Yeah.
mean, just not to derail it again, but I do think that there is an a priori deducibility from the physical facts to the phenomenal facts. The stipulation is you need to have the right concepts, right? So Mary needs to have phenomenal concepts and make the deductions. And so she
Right.
can't do it in her room, obviously, because she doesn't have the right concepts. But I always think that that's a kind of a missing component of that entire debate, which is, of course, she's unfairly constrained. It's like telling her to deduce that water is H2O without knowing what water is. Like, she can't do it, obviously.
Yeah, I mean, she can be told what water is. Like the concept of water is one that can be communicated. It seems like in a way that the concept of red can't. So
Right.
that looks like that's an important difference that kind of cries out for an explanation.
Right. I mean, even there, I think you can. Anyway, so I'm noticing that we're getting well on in the time. I'm supposed to be actually at a seminar here in a little bit. Actually,
Oh dear.
but I have seen some
Oh, yeah?
some comments in the chat. I wanted to just ask you about really
Sure.
quickly. So specifically, and I know you have views about this, so I wanted to make sure give you a chance to talk about it if you want to. And this is about composite minds. So Luke, who has been following the conversation and has asked a couple of times, I wonder what your view about composite minds has, whether it has implications for the philosophy of social sciences. What are sociologists explaining according to you? And earlier he asked about whether you could get him a kind of analytical Marxism. No, sorry, an analytic philosophy of Marxian class consciousness from your point of view. So do you have anything that you want to say about that, or is that?
So I definitely think that my view has implications in that direction, and it bears on how we think about groups larger than the human scale. You know, what do I think about composite minds? I'm a composite mind, so
Right.
I have no objection to there being composite minds, you know, at a level up.
And you even think like the U.S. could be a composite mind if it were integrated in the right way.
Yeah, I think if panpsychism is true, it is already a very disorganized composite mind. Just like, you know, if I say that tables are conscious, the US will be as well. It's just that, like tables, it won't have any of the kind of conscious structure that we're used to thinking about.
Right.
If we integrated it, we changed the way that it processes information, we could make it more like a mind of the sort that we're familiar with, more like us. And that's what Ned Block's nation brain that I talk about in the book is precisely, you know, trying to do.
Right.
At the same time, although I think that my view kind of has implications in that direction, I do also want to underline that to get to like political prescriptions, you have to go a long way, and you have to like work through a whole bunch of the intermediate stages that, you know, that sociologists, for instance, do study. And so I don't think that there's going to be like a direct, you know, jump from anything that I've said to Marxian class consciousness, any more than there's a direct jump from, you know, anything about, you know, micro subjects to, you know, how the brain works at a high level. I also think that, so there's an ambiguity in the way that class consciousness is used, and I think it's important to distinguish between individuals being conscious of their position in a class and having, you know, the moral outlook and the sympathies that are appropriate to that awareness, versus the idea of the class itself being conscious. And, you know, so I guess I'm inclined to say, yeah, the class itself may well be conscious, but probably not in a way that will be very useful for, you know, figuring out how it's going to overthrow capitalism.
Yeah, interesting. So I guess I can't resist asking you before we haven't even talked about 2/3 of your book, let alone a bunch of other stuff that you've written. So maybe if you're willing, I would like to have you back to talk about that other stuff. So,
Sure, yeah, I'm happy to come back.
Okay, cool.
I'm not going anywhere.
You're stuck in it. Yeah, exactly.
I am.
For the foreseeable future. Well, it's good to have you here, obviously, and I enjoyed talking with you. But anyway, so let me just at the end here ask you about the kind of ethical stuff, because I have heard sort of disturbing things from panpsychists before about ethical implications. You know, for example, for someone like me, I'm a vegan for ethical reasons.
Oh, awesome.
And I was raised vegetarian. I'm a big animal person, and Sometimes you hear people say, and I've heard even respectable panpsychists say things like this, that, well, you got to eat something, and everything's conscious. And so why, the broccoli's conscious, the cow's conscious. So, what are you going to do? You got to eat something conscious. And that to me, it's pretty disturbing, actually. If panpsychism had that kind of implication, then I would find that, well, disturbing. So what is your view about that sort of, is it wrong morally to disassemble the chair? Is it wrong to eat that?
No.
So I'm curious about just that general line.
Yeah, so I should say I'm also a vegan for ethical reasons, and so I have kind of dwelt on this this dilemma, and I think that the key thing is that it's not consciousness per se that is of moral significance. We tend to talk in that way because, as non-panpsychists, we tend to use consciousness as kind of a shorthand for a lot of particular forms and features of consciousness.
Right.
In particular, I think that the ethical standing of a given creature is intimately tied to its capacity for valenced experience, its capacity for goal-directed behavior, its capacity to have preferences about what some things being better than other things.
Right.
And I think that the best way to infer that kind of structure in consciousness is to look for the sorts of behavioral manifestations that we associate with it in ourselves. I know that when I don't like something, that's reflected in my behavior in certain ways. And if I see analogous behavior in Sebastian, my cat, then I think that's good evidence for Sebastian having preferences. And I think that's a good reason to take Sebastian to be a being with ethical status.
But why don't you say the same thing about electrons when they're repulsed from positives and so forth, and retracted by negatives or whatever?
Yeah, so I mean, part of the answer is going to be that they don't seem to display what you might think of as teleological behavior that is pursuing the same goal in different ways under different circumstances. There isn't that kind of regularity where whichever situation you put them in, they'll always kind of find the way to get back to a certain state. I think it's also worth noting that, even if electrons, are in some sense, I don't know, if they want whatever it is that they're moving towards, the upshot for the electrons, if I disassemble the chair and if I don't, is pretty similar. Like it's not like that's going to add up to the chair preferring, to be electrons in one set of stable energy orbits than being electrons in another set of stable energy orbits.
Right.
I
mean, in some sense, though, right? Doesn't the table as a subject, it's affected by this?
It's affected
consciously. It's like its experiences.
But
its experiences it doesn't care about that.
It doesn't. Yeah, that's what I'd want to say. Like, there's a change in consciousness, but not a change that anyone cares about.
Right.
And I think this is kind of reinforced by remembering that the changes in consciousness will just continue after I disassemble the table. There's still consciousness around. So in some moods, I find that even mildly comforting that that at my death,
just afterwards,
yeah, it won't be just like completely turning off the lights. It'll be like dissolving, but continuing to kind of be there in the waterway dissolving. Of course, I still won't care, and I won't have any of the things that I want, and there won't really be what's recognizable as distinctively me. So it's not that comforting, and I don't want to oversell it there. Yeah. But I do have a paper that I co-authored with Jed Buchanan on this, about panpsychism, intuitions, and sorry?
Was that the Imagine If It Happened to You, or that's a different paper?
No, it's a different one. It's the Great Chain of Being, panpsychism and intuition. It's trying to say most of the intuitions that we have about consciousness in particular things, like they're not, like we don't have to throw them out if we're panpsychists. We keep them. We need to kind of re-understand what they're telling us, but they're still going to be telling us about the ethically important sorts of consciousness. So in that regard, panpsychism is not going to have very revisionary ethical implications.
Yeah, that's good, because I was getting the sense from like some things you said, maybe the electrons desire unity or something like that. And if you break apart the chair, then you are thwarting a desire of theirs. And
I mean,
preference utilitarians might not be okay with that, because if there's enough electrons whose desires are being thwarted, their preferences are being thwarted, the preference for unity. So it seemed like if you combine those two views, then you do get some really strange results. But maybe you're not a preference utilitarian, or you don't think ultimately that's what's going on down there.
I think it's unlikely. So it's possible that what's going on down there has something in common with what I think of as desire and preference, but I think it's unlikely that none of the differences between me and the electron are like responsible for the moral status that I have. I think also, just on the chair and the unity, if I burn up the chair, the particles, from their point of view, all they know is that they've exchanged one chemical bond for a different, perhaps tighter one. Maybe that's what they prefer, or maybe that's what they hate. It's also important epistemically that we have no way of knowing if they hate strong covalent bonds or if they love strong covalent bonds. So, to a certain extent,
this covalent bond.
And like you could say a similar thing, I think, to a moral realist. For all that we know, there might be just non-natural moral properties out there that attach to certain obscure physical situations and that outweigh all of the moral properties we're familiar with.
Right.
Given that we can't know them, what we have to do as moral agents is kind of remain within the moral universe that we can make sense of.
But it doesn't. So your view is not going to extend like to trees, or because chairs and trees seem importantly different. And is there going to be an environmental aspect to this, or no?
I'm not sure, because I think it will depend on what you were already going to think about trees. A lot of all the features that differentiate trees from chairs, people already know about them, and people can already make arguments about, the tree seeming to be organized in a way that's goal directed, even if that goal isn't as clearly manifest in the ongoing moment to moment processing that it does. And adding that, all of these different sorts of processing are accompanied by some sort of consciousness. I don't think that all sorts of consciousness are automatically morally relevant in the same way. So I don't think that this tells us how to answer these questions about trees. I mean,
there are some people who do think that, though, that consciousness is what makes something valuable.
Yeah.
And so what I'm hearing you saying is, no, it's the kind of consciousness, actually.
Yeah.
So if everything's conscious, then what we got to differentiate is between the morally relevant kinds of consciousness and the ones that aren't.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah.
And I've been talking actually to Jamie, who runs the website sentientism.org, possibly .com, which is about
afterwards.
So spreading the idea of sentientism, that moral status belongs to all sentient beings, and I think there is this kind of slight looseness about what counts as a sentient being.
Right.
Is it just a conscious being, or is it a being with the sort of consciousness involved in suffering and joy? And I asked him, and he said, in practice, those seem like they largely go together, unless panpsychism is true. So I don't have to decide. If panpsychism is true, then they don't always go together, and I think that's going to be a reason to decide that it's the particular sort of consciousness that matters.
Right. And where, on your view, does deontology fit into this picture? Is it something that makes a difference here, or is that an added bit? Or you deontology, maybe, I don't know.
I'm open to deontology. I think that just as the kind of paradigmatic consequentialist considerations are intuitively tied to consciousness via states like preference and pleasure, I think that the paradigmatic deontological moral considerations, like non-interference or respect for autonomy, are tied to consciousness through the particular sort of consciousness involved in decision-making and choice.
Yeah.
Kant, for instance, is a famous deontologist, and he's is all about the rational will, that capacity we have to set laws for ourselves. And a panpsychist might think that that requires consciousness, but they don't think that it's present in all conscious beings.
Right. But there's something, yeah, so there's like a practical rationality, reasoning about how to get what you want.
Mm-hmm.
And certainly electrons are not going to be doing anything like that.
Mm-hmm.
But I guess I was thinking more about universalizability considerations.
Mm-hmm.
Whether we have to include like conscious chairs or trees in the things which we're universalizing over. And because I'm kind of very influenced by, I guess, Korsgaard's kind of arguments that say, well, you start with the ontological considerations and you get like stuff about animals in there because
Mm-hmm.
you universalize, they have to be the part, you're a sentient being, they're sentient, so you have to include them. I mean, I'm butchering the argument here, but yeah, you understand what I'm saying. So if you include, I hope you do anyway, if you include trees now all of a sudden as conscious agents that are sentient, well, I guess they're not agents. Well, maybe they are actually. Trees are very sophisticated. I don't know. Anyway, so if you have to include things like that, then we may get obligations towards them in the same way that we might get obligations towards animals from certain sorts of deontological positions.
Yeah. So I don't know Korsgaard's particular argument that well, but my understanding is that agency is important there.
Right.
And I guess I would say something sort of similar to what I said before. There's a debate to have about whether trees are agents. It looks like my initial inclination is to lean towards the no, or at least to lean towards there are some important respects in which they're not agents.
Right.
I think that debate would still have to be had if we thought they were conscious. Like it would change slightly. If for instance, you thought that agency requires consciousness and trees are definitely not conscious, then you've got a shortcut to denying that they have agency. But it doesn't, the panpsychism won't decide the issue for you, even if it inflects how you have that debate about agency.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Okay, yeah, I see. All right, well, I like that. So
Okay, good.
I'm happy I asked about that. I do have to let you go at this point because
Okay.
I'm very late, and I apologize for keeping you so long. But let
No
me just
problem.
say,
It's been a pleasure.
work is, I highly recommend it to people. I'll put links to all your stuff out there. But
Brilliant. Thank you.
it's the paradigm of good philosophical work.
Wow. Okay.
And so I think more people should aspire towards these kinds of big ideas and defending them in a very serious way.
Okay, you're going to make me blush, but yeah, thank you. That's
I
very
want
kind of you to say.
Take this very seriously, and I feel like, yeah, it's we need more people like you in the profession. I'm glad you're here, and I really appreciate your work.
Oh, I really appreciate the work that you do on this series, and in your writing. Like I think
Or that too.
The profession benefits immeasurably.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Well, and I will be bugging you since you said you might come back. I will be bugging you coming back someday. So Luke, thanks again for joining me, and just hang out for a bit and I'll say bye off the air.
Okay, sure.
All right, we're clear.